Welcome to Texas Cattle Trails. I'm your host, Wayne Ludwig, author of The Old Chisholm Trail, From Cowpath to Tourist Stop, published by Texas A&M University Press. This is part 2 of Cartography and the Chisholm Trail. If you haven't watched part 1 yet, it might be helpful to watch part 1 before watching part 2. So I hope you enjoy it. Thanks for watching, and let's move on down the trail. In part 1, we saw that modern maps, maps from the Texas Historical Commission and the National Park Service, show the Chisholm Trail mapped from an origin point of San Antonio through Texas, past Red River Station, along and east of the 98th meridian, along the route of US Highway 81 through Oklahoma, and then on to Abilene, Kansas. But when we look at the contemporary surveys and maps from the 1870s and 1880s, we see that the Texas portion of this trail is designated as the Eastern Trail. The Oklahoma portion of the trail is designated as the Abilene Trail or Abilene Cattle Trail. And the Kansas portion of the trail is designated as the Texas Cattle Trail or the Abilene Cattle Trail. The modern maps show the Chisholm Trail from Texas past Red River Station and on to Abilene, Kansas. But when we look at the contemporary maps from the 1870s and 1880s, while the trail was actually being used, they don't mention the Chisholm Trail anywhere along this route. So where is the Chisholm Trail? This is a detail from a map of the Chickasaw country. This is an 1872 U.S. Army map. The original trail did not lead to Red River Station as depicted on modern maps. The original trail led past Gainesville, Texas in Cook County, and then north past Fort Arbuckle in Indian Territory. And this was the trail that was used from the time that the railhead opened in Abilene, Kansas during the summer of 1867 up until the time Fort Arbuckle closed in 1870. After Fort Arbuckle closed, then the trail shifted west to Red River Station. And let's look at this real quick. And Interstate 35, for reference, crosses the Red River right about here. So this gives you a little bit of a reference. These circles indicate about a half a dozen places to cross the Red River in the vicinity of Gainesville. Notice that there's a network of trails leading from these crossings, and these trails lead on to the north and converge up near Fort Arbuckle. And we see a couple of examples of using origin or destination as road names. Here's Cloud Road, named because it led past Ike Cloud's ranch, located right down here. And we see the Gainesville Road, named because it led to and from Gainesville, Texas. And these are two more examples of origin destination as road names. And let's move a little farther north up the trail. Now, this is also a detail from the 1872 map of the Chickasaw country. As we follow the trail north toward Fort Arbuckle, we find on this detail down in the lower left portion, here's Cloud Road. This is the Gainesville Road where it merged into Cloud Road, and then the trail leads on towards the fort. Here is Fort Arbuckle up near the top of the detail. And notice that there is another network of trails leading into and away from Fort Arbuckle from different directions. We followed the trail north from Fort Arbuckle to the North Canadian River. And we're looking at a General Land Office detail from a General Land Office survey plat from 1872. And this is at the present site of Oklahoma City. We see the North Canadian River indicated here. We see it indicated down here near the bottom of the detail as the North Fork of the Canadian River. During the 1850s, Jesse Chisholm established a trading post here in the vicinity of the North Canadian River. Earlier during the 1840s, he established a trading post a few miles west of the present site of Asher, Oklahoma. And this trading post would be between the present sites of Asher and Purcell. Now, the southernmost point of the Chisholm Trail, as it was surveyed, is a few miles north of the present site of Purcell. So the southernmost point of the Chisholm Trail, as it was surveyed here on these original surveys of Indian Territory, would be in the general vicinity of Chisholm's 1840s era trading post. This trail he used to travel between his trading posts became known locally as Chisholm's Trail. And later it became part of the cattle trail, and it was designated by surveyors we see here as the Chisholm Cattle Trail. Okay, we followed the trail northwest from the present site of Oklahoma City. We're now in the vicinity of the present site of Kingfisher. Here's Kingfisher Creek. We're at the Cimarron River, and this is from an 1871 General Land Office survey. And 1871 was a peak year for trail drives. There were more herds on the trail this year than any other year. These surveyors were likely choking on the trail dust and talking to the drovers as they passed. So keep this in mind as we move along the trail. The surveyors designated this route, this trail here, as the Chisholm Trail. This is the trail that we're following. This trail here is designated as the Abilene Trail. Despite some of the stories we hear, it's clear from the surveys that these were two separate trails. They were not one trail, as some have claimed. So the Chisholm Trail merged into the Abilene Trail right here, just south of the Cimarron River. This also represents the northernmost point of the Chisholm Trail as it was surveyed. Now, before we go any further, after saying that, there's a case to be made to extend the Chisholm Trail name all the way to Wichita, Kansas. And the reason is that in 1864, Jesse Chisholm established yet another trading post at the site that became Wichita. This trail leading south across the Cimarron and along this route to the North Canadian River is the trail that Chisholm used to travel between his trading post in Kansas and his trading posts in Indian Territory. So it took on the name Chisholm's Trail and retained the name for part of this trail after Chisholm died, and it became part of the cattle trail. Despite all of the arguments and debates about the trail name, the fact is that this is the documentation that we're left with. And the surveyors designated this trail north of the Cimarron River as the Abilene Cattle Trail. According to the surveys and the documentation, the Chisholm Trail ended right here at the northernmost point, just south of the Cimarron River. And this detail is from an 1879 U.S. Department of the Interior map of Indian Territory. And the Interior Department published several maps of Indian Territory during this historical period. We see the white arrows indicate the location of Chisholm's Cattle Trail or Chisholm Trail over here. This is the North Canadian River down here, Cimarron River up here. We see the Abilene Trail or Abilene Cattle Trail indicated by the red arrows, and Chisholm's Trail merges into the Abilene Trail here on the south side of the Cimarron River. We see that the two trails are about 20 miles apart, maybe a little farther, where they cross the North Canadian River. Now, some folks will say, well, it's all the same trail, so let's just call it all the Chisholm Trail. Well, we can see from this map and from the surveys that this is a false statement. They were two separate trails with two separate routes. And this is a detail from a U.S. Department of the Interior map of Indian Territory from 1887. This is another one of those maps that was published by the Interior Department during this historical period. This is the vicinity near the present site of Enid, Oklahoma, and we see that the trail is designated in this area again as the Abilene Cattle Trail, in this case the Abilene Cattle Trail and Stage Road. Now let's take a look at this map. This is the old Chisholm Cattle Trail with subsidiary trails in Texas, 1873. When I first started doing research on this subject back in 2011, there was a fellow that pulled this map out of a briefcase and said something along the lines of, "It's the Chisholm Trail in Texas, and this map is proof." And here's why. He said that it says 1873 right down here, and it says Chisholm Trail right up here. These lines in Texas are connected with this line up here. Therefore, all of this in Texas is the Chisholm Trail. Now that is stretching it quite a bit. This map, if you look up the Chisholm Trail on the internet, there is a Wikipedia article that includes this map, unless the map has been removed recently. But you'll find this map appear occasionally. If you're a member of any history groups on social media, such as Facebook, you'll find that someone will occasionally post this map as proof of the Chisholm Trail's existence somewhere. Most commonly, I find that it gets posted and presented as alleged proof of the Chisholm Trail's existence in Texas. But there's some big problems with this map, and let's take a closer look. All right, let's zoom in on a couple of details here. First, let's look at the citation. Note that there's no publisher information listed. And remember, we talked in part one about maps off of the internet that do not include a citation. In this case, we have a partial citation. We have a title and a date, but without a publisher, we don't know who published the map or when it was published. Therefore, we don't know if this date is accurate or not. So we do have another clue. And if we look down in the lower right, down by the Rio Grande, down here in the fine print, we find drawn by A.W. Ziegelash. And if we do a little research on Mr. Ziegelash, we find that according to the U.S. Census, this is Adrian W. Ziegelash, and it turns out that Mr. Ziegelash was born in 1893. And that's a showstopper. This map, therefore, cannot be authentic to 1873. And so this map likely represents someone's idea of the Chisholm Trail at some point later on versus an actual 1873 document showing the Chisholm Trail. So this map is pretty much worthless as far as historical research goes. This is an example of what a citation from a map from this historical period should look like. This is a U.S. Army map. Here's the map title. We've got a date, and we've got a publisher. So this tells us everything we need to know about the source for this map. And this is another quick example of what a citation from a map from this historical period should look like. We have a map title, Indian Territory. This is the U.S. Department of the Interior map. We got Department of the Interior, General Land Office. We've got a date, and we have a publisher. So this tells us everything we need to know about the source for this map. Modern maps without a citation or with only a partial citation that don't tell you who drew the map or who published the map are more likely someone's idea of what they think the Chisholm Trail should be versus an actual historical document. So proceed with caution when it comes to modern Chisholm Trail maps, and be careful what you believe out there. And this is a list of maps from the trail's historic period of use that show the Chisholm Trail in Texas, up US 81 through Oklahoma, or in Kansas. And this slide is blank, and it's not an accident. It's blank because there are no maps with provenance to the trail's historic period of use that shows the Chisholm Trail anywhere in Texas, up the route of US Highway 81 through Oklahoma, or in Kansas. These are the foundation sources, or what I call the foundation sources, for the modern Chisholm Trail narrative and the modern Chisholm Trail maps. We talked about these a little in part one. These are the sources that we tend to see referenced a little more frequently than others in books and articles about the Chisholm Trail. Now, the first one listed, Joseph McCoy's 1874 book. This is the only one of these sources published during the trail's actual historic period of use. McCoy mentioned Chisholm Trail one time in his book, and it was in relation or in the context of, and these are McCoy's words, Chisholm Trail, so named for a semi-civilized Indian who is said to have traveled it first. So this is a reference to Jesse Chisholm's original trade trail between his trading posts. This is certainly not applying this term to the entire trail from Texas to Kansas, as some folks have tried to do. The rest of these sources here, these are all secondary sources, again published during the 20th century. By definition, remember, a secondary source is removed from the actual period of the event. And also by definition, these are subject to changing perceptions and opinions over the years and other factors. So be aware of this. There's also a few cases where one author made a statement that appeared in print. Other subsequent authors repeated that statement, and nobody bothered to check to see if the first author got it right. So there's a few cases where mistakes have been repeated throughout the cattle trail's history, and that has helped to skew the trail's history accordingly. So be careful with these secondary sources. It doesn't hurt to go back and look up their references and spot check those references once in a while to make sure it's on track. This is a list of the foundation sources that referenced the original surveys of Indian Territory or the maps from the trail's historic period of use in their footnotes or bibliographies. And well, this slide is blank because none of those foundation sources, the sources on which our modern Chisholm Trail historical narrative is built, none of those sources referenced any of the original surveys of Indian Territory or any of the Interior Department maps or the U.S. Army maps from the trail's historic period of use. So all of those primary documents that tell us exactly where the Chisholm Trail was located have been left out of the story. This is the 1933 Oklahoma Highway Commission map that we saw in part one. We also saw in part one that the Highway Commission designated the northern and southern portions of the cattle trail that led generally along the route of Highway 81 through the state as the Chisholm Trail. This is the middle portion of that map, and let's take a closer look. On the detail on the right, we see the citation with the title, the date, 1933, and a reference to HB 149. House Bill 149 was where the Oklahoma legislature charged the Highway Commission with the task of locating and mapping the Chisholm Trail. And this map is a result of that legislation. The project manager was H.S. Tennant. His project report was published in a 1936 edition of Chronicles of Oklahoma. And when we look at Tennant's report, we see that he used as references visible traces of the trail that remained at this time during the early 1930s. He also used letters and interviews that were solicited during the research period during the early 1930s. And he also mentioned using township surveys as reference. And remember the township surveys, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But we see that the trail was also designated the Chisholm Trail through this portion of the trail. And this again is the trail generally along US 81. There's a big problem with this map. Remember, the reason for the map in the first place was to locate and map the Chisholm Trail. Also remember that Jesse Chisholm, established a trading post somewhere down in this vicinity off of this map detail during the 1840s. Chisholm also established another trading post up here at the North Canadian River in this vicinity, the present site of Oklahoma City, during the 1850s. In 1864, Chisholm established another trading post at the site that became Wichita, Kansas. Where the heck is Chisholm's Trail? The trail that Jesse Chisholm used to travel between his trading posts and was known locally during this time as Chisholm's Trail, and was the reason that the Chisholm Trail name existed and was applied to this portion of the cattle trail in the first place, is not even on the map. This is a big problem for a map that was supposed to locate and map the Chisholm Trail. What it appears happened is that when Tennant used the township surveys, he apparently used the township surveys to confirm the visible traces of the trail that were still visible over here at this time during the early 30s, and maybe fill in the gaps between the visible traces of the trail. While he apparently referred to the geographical portion and geographical location of these surveys, and this trail is pretty much accurate according to the surveys, the trail route, he apparently ignored the surveyor's original designations of Abilene Trail and Abilene Cattle Trail and applied the opinions of resulting from the interviews and letters during the early 1930s. So what we apparently have here, since it omits Jesse Chisholm's Trail, the original Chisholm Trail over here, and applies the Chisholm Trail name over here, what apparently happened is that this map represents the 1930s perception or idea of what the Chisholm Trail was thought to be, and does not represent an actual historical representation of the Chisholm Trail. So we have to be careful with these modern maps. And this is also an example of how modern perception and opinion has altered the historical narrative of the Chisholm Trail. So we have to be real careful when we evaluate these. Now let's look at the evidence. We've seen examples of the General Land Office surveys, the original surveys of Indian Territory, and there are 47 township plats that were done from the Red River, across from Red River Station all the way along the trail route to the southern line of Kansas. In 35 of these survey plats, the surveyors designated the trail name as the Abilene Trail or the Abilene Cattle Trail. The Chisholm Trail was only designated one time along this trail route, and that was where it merged as a side trail into the Abilene Trail at the south side of the Cimarron River. Then we saw that the Marion County, Kansas survey map from 1876 also used the term Abilene Cattle Trail for this trail route. So the General Land Office was consistent in their use of the term Abilene Trail or Abilene Cattle Trail to designate this cattle trail north of the Red River through Indian Territory and into Kansas. Remember we said earlier that the original trail did not lead to Red River Station as depicted on modern trail maps. The original trail led past Fort Arbuckle, and when we follow that trail from the Red River north past Fort Arbuckle along the trail route on the surveys, we find 46 township plats from the Red River past Fort Arbuckle to the Cimarron River. Now, this number includes a certain amount of doubling of numbers, because remember there were a half a dozen places to cross the Red River. So there were a certain amount of parallel trail routes involved, which sort of inflates the total number of township plats here. But all of that aside, we did not look at all of the surveys from the Red River because of time, and there's quite a few of these involved here. This involved a trail network of both named and unnamed trails, and the trail names found on the surveys are listed here on this slide. And this network of trails led past Fort Arbuckle and then led to the Chisholm Trail. So we can see from the surveys and this system of named and unnamed trails that stories that indicate that the Chisholm Trail was an unbroken trail that led all the way to the Red River are just not true. We find 12 township plats that designate the Chisholm Trail, Chisholm's Trail, or Chisholm's Cattle Trail between the Canadian River and the Cimarron River. And these are all terms that were used by surveyors to designate this stretch of Jesse Chisholm's old trade route between his trading posts. And we also find by the surveys that the southernmost point of the Chisholm Trail was located as surveyed a few miles north of the present site of Purcell, Oklahoma, and the northernmost point of the Chisholm Trail as surveyed was located where the Chisholm Trail merged into the Abilene Cattle Trail at the south side of the Cimarron River. This is a list of maps published by government agencies during the 1870s and 1880s, and this list includes the U.S. Army, the General Land Office, and the U.S. Department of the Interior. Sources don't get much better than this, and according to these sources, the Chisholm Trail name does not appear anywhere along the route designated by modern maps as the Chisholm Trail. We can conclude based on evidence that the General Land Office, the Interior Department, or both already designated the trail route past Red River Station that is represented and promoted as the Chisholm Trail. This was designated as the Eastern Trail in Texas in 1881, the Abilene Trail or the Abilene Cattle Trail in Oklahoma and Kansas from 1871 through 1887. These surveys and maps have solid provenance to the trail's historic period of use. The surveys, the General Land Office surveys, are the original legal documents that describe these trails. Other than an occasional vague reference by 20th century authors to government maps with no other information provided, these historical surveys and maps have been excluded. These documents are official government documents. The surveys and maps are the only known consistent documents that are consistent regarding the trail names throughout the entire post-Civil War trail driving period. Newspapers are inconsistent, trail drivers' accounts are inconsistent, but these maps are consistent. So the result is that the documents that give us the exact location and name designations of these trails as they were during their historic period of use have been left out of the story. We can also conclude that there are no maps from the trail's historic period of use that shows the Chisholm Trail along the route that is represented on modern maps as the Chisholm Trail. And remember those secondary sources that we discussed earlier in the presentation? There are no maps from the trail's historic period of use that shows the Chisholm Trail along the route past Red River Station that is typically represented by the 20th century authors as the Chisholm Trail. In fact, the historical maps from the trail's historic period of use contradict this story. I worked with an artist at Wild West magazine to produce this map to accompany a Chisholm Trail article that appeared in Wild West. This map shows the main cattle trail that we've been discussing in this presentation through Texas past Red River Station to Abilene, Kansas, as it was mapped during its period of use by official entities. So let's take a closer look. We have already seen that the map, or that the trail along this route past Red River Station was designated as the Eastern Trail through in Texas, through Oklahoma as the Abilene Cattle Trail, and into Kansas as the Abilene Cattle Trail. The blue dotted line represents the network of trails leading from the Red River past Fort Arbuckle that led to the Chisholm Trail, and this was the original trail used during the first few years of the trail's period of use. The red line between the words Indian and Territory indicates the Chisholm Trail as it was surveyed and mapped during its period of use. By period of use, we're talking about period of use as a cattle trail. So let's clarify that. This also represents the only place that the Chisholm Trail appeared on any map that we know of during the entire post-Civil War trail driving period. So now this is not intended by any means to diminish any of Jesse Chisholm's accomplishments during his life and career. What it is intended to do is compare and put in perspective the Chisholm Trail over here as it was mapped during its period and surveyed during its period of use as a cattle trail, and put that in perspective with what is commonly represented today as the Chisholm Trail over here along this much longer route that was designated as the Eastern and Abilene Trail. And when we look at that, we can see that the Chisholm Trail was just a very small fraction of the overall trail length. And this is a list of sources for maps that we've seen in part 2, and these maps are all available to the public. The modern Chisholm Trail maps and the corresponding narrative are based on old, outdated research and information. We've seen examples in this presentation where critical historical evidence, such as the surveys and maps from the trail's historic period of use, have been excluded from this story. We have a case here in Fort Worth where it's an old, cold criminal case from the 1970s. And evidence from this case was recently re-examined using new DNA technology. This new technology led to the discovery of new evidence, which changed the old conclusions and in turn led to the arrest of a suspect. Now, the situation we have here with trails research is similar to this. New technology has led to the discovery of new evidence that was overlooked or excluded for whatever reason by all of those 20th century researchers and authors. So it's one thing to act on the best information available, which is what the 20th century authors undoubtedly did. They acted on the best information they had at the time. Now that best information has changed, and we know more now than we did 40, 50, 100 years ago. So the question is, what do we do with the evidence? Do we ignore it and continue to promote what we now know to be myth as historical fact? Or do we include the evidence, revise the story, and put these trail names in their proper context? Well, on the one hand, we have the modern mapped version of the Chisholm Trail, which is supported by, well, it seems to only be supported by something someone said decades after the fact. With no evidence to back it up, that's the definition of hearsay evidence. Hearsay evidence, by definition, is inherently unreliable. And we can see that in the modern Chisholm Trail maps because they are inconsistent. On the other hand, we have the surveys and maps, the official government documents that show us the exact location of the Chisholm Trail during its historic period of use as a cattle trail. We've also seen that the Chisholm Trail, as it was surveyed and mapped, was only a very small portion of the overall cattle trail from South Texas to central Kansas. So what happened? What happened that caused the Chisholm Trail to change geographic locations and grow to many times its original length? Well, the answer to that is promoters. During the early 20th century, promoters applied the Chisholm Trail name to the much longer Eastern and Abilene Trail. And that story, along with supporting documentation, is included in my book. And this is the book, The Old Chisholm Trail, From Cowpath to Tourist Stop. And this slide lists a few places where the book is available. The General Land Office surveys that we saw in the presentation are not listed in the book because I did not find those until the book was in publication. However, the maps, the General Land Office, Interior Department, and Army maps that we saw in the presentation are included in the book, and these were based on the original surveys of Indian Territory. If you're interested in a signed copy, you can email me at Texas Cattle Trails, and that's all one word, texascattletrails@gmail.com. Also, if you'd like to submit any questions or comments, you can send those to me at the same address, and that's texascattletrails@gmail.com. Well, this has been a fun project. I enjoyed putting this thing together. I'd like to thank Margaret and Gary Kreisinger for their assistance in putting this presentation together. I'd also like to thank my wife for her patience and the use of the dining room table as a recording studio. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I hope you learned something, and we might do this again if there's interest out there. So anyway, well, that wraps it up. Thanks for joining us. Hope to see you again. And until then, take care. Have a good day and happy trails.